and welcome to another SARA webinar. Today is a discussion of institutional complaint processes. This is Jenny Parks, and I am so glad all of you could be with us here today. You'll see on our slide here we have a few technical notes. Hopefully you've been able to take advantage of those and use them as you've waited. So I'm going to advance to our title. This is Helping Prospective SARA Institutions Tighten Up Their Complaint Processes. As always, I need to thank our sponsors, the Lumina Foundation. The work of launching all of the SARAs is supported by a generous grant from Lumina. And today we have people joining us from a number of places. We have Sarah Appel from the Indiana Commission for Higher Education, Mary Ann Boke from NCHEM, we have Linda Dahmer from Embry-Riddle University, and we also have Alan Contreras on from NC SARA. And as always, I have Mary Robertson being my technical director here, and Emily Jacobson, our SARA coordinator, helping out with the chat. That's me. You probably are all used to that photo by now. And there's Sarah. There's Mary Ann. There's Alan. And now our newcomer today, Linda. So everyone will give a silent welcome there to Linda, who is helping us understand the Department of Defense complaint procedures and compliance, and sharing with us some information about her practice in this area at Embry-Riddle. All right. As usual, I wanted to make sure that everyone understood the structure of the webinar. The first part will be just an introduction to higher ed complaints. Why are we even looking at this? Why is it so important? Then we're going to look at the anatomy of a complaint. What makes something a complaint versus a concern, for example. Then we're going to look at what a state complaint process needs to look like, both from a best practices and from a federal compliance perspective. We're also going to then look at specific requirements for Title IV and DoD under Title IV and the Department of Defense rules. And then we will look in more depth at the SARA complaint process than we've been able to bring to you yet in a webinar, because I know a lot of people want to know how does the SARA complaint process compare to these others, and that's why we needed to give you the context of those others prior to offering the details on the SARA complaint process. And then finally, at the end, 30 minutes for questions and answers, as we usually do. I wanted to remind you that we will be responding to your chatted questions along the way as we are able, but we'll also follow up with all the chat questions, any that were answered or unanswered, in a written document that we will email to all of our participants today by the 24th. And the presentation will be, of course, recorded and posted to our website and on YouTube, as it always is, so that you can refer to it in the future or refer others to it. All right. So in this first section, we're going to talk about why are we even examining this topic today and what actually is a complaint. And that would be me and Sarah Appel who are talking to you about that. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, it'll give you a reference on who is talking. That was a suggestion someone gave us a few webinars ago, and people seem to like that. So anyway, as we do the work of recruiting institutions and supporting them as they contemplate joining SARA, we get a lot of questions about why. Explain to me about the complaint process. Why I'm actually hearing a lot about it recently. What's going on? Don't we have a complaint process? Do we really need to do anything with it? And the answer is yes. So let me give you some of the context for why complaint processes are something that we are seeing in higher ed discussions more and more these days, and in the Chronicle, et cetera. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that we are in an era of increasingly student-oriented policies and practices in higher education. If you think about, with the rise of the for-profits having a very consumer-friendly model of serving students, all the way down to now the new college scorecards coming out of the Obama administration, the idea is that the college student is a consumer, and consumers need a way to voice their concerns or any issues they have. So this is a consumer service piece that really has not been as heavily emphasized in the past by higher education. Likewise, again, I mentioned the rise of the for-profit institutions. We have good actors and bad actors in that community. And we also have an increase in complaints and institutional closures because of that. So again, the communication between students and what they need and the institution and other layers of governance, other parts of the triad, needs to be more thoughtful and more thorough. We also are seeing a lot of attorneys general around the nation and the U.S. Department of Education focusing more on consumer protection and complaint processes. In several states right now, the platform, a key plank in the platform of several attorneys general is making sure that complaint processes are allowing people to have more voice and that there's more scrutiny involving for-profit institutions. There are also a number of class action suits across the nation where attorneys general are collaborating to go after certain groups of institutions. There are more investigations, and even out of the Department of Defense, well, Executive Order 13607, which was the Principles of Excellence concerning service members and their families, even in that document, President Obama is saying institutions need to serve their constituents better, particularly their military-associated constituents, and part of that process is an effective complaint process. There is also just a general rise in compliance requirements coming out of the Department of Education with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And we are seeing a trend among these greater requirements for compliance, whether that's in Title IX, Clery Act, FERPA. We're seeing the beginnings of some heftier penalties coming along if you are non-compliant. And we can just go back even to the program integrity rules that came out October 29, 2010. They are the U.S. Department of Ed is definitely saying we need to exert a little more pressure and a little more scrutiny over what's going on in the rest of the triad. And finally, we're in an era of new modalities and new student populations, and as such, the practice of higher education changes. There are more opportunities for misunderstandings, missteps, and mistakes. And we just haven't been doing it that long. Better complaint procedures help us navigate these waters and make sure that the institution and its students are communicating and that the student needs are being met. So that's my little bit about why we're doing this. I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah, who is going to talk to you about the anatomy of a complaint.
Hi, this is Sarah. I'm going to talk about anatomy of a complaint. You'll see probably a lot of text in these slides just because the information we feel is very important and that you have easy access to it. So a complaint is an expression of dissatisfaction that really has an impact on a student's program of study or their academic progress. It alleges that an institution or one of its actors has violated a policy, a federal or state law, best practices, and any other agreements that have been joined in by the institution. Again, complaint has to do with academic progress. So a compliant complaint, besides your usual information about the student's name, institution, that kind of thing, there are some things that really need to be included in the complaint process for the institution. Always direct the student to go through the institutional complaint process before pursuing other paths. We want to make sure that students understand that each institution has a very specific path in filing a complaint, and there are sometimes things that they need to do before they actually file an official complaint, like just talk to the teacher, talk to your advisor. Let students know what kinds of complaints can be and cannot be reviewed. Some complaints that institutions cannot review would be things that are out of their purview, such as civil rights issues, disability complaints. Complaints cannot be anonymous. There are very certain exceptions, certain complaints about sexual harassment and assault, and those minors, of course, those go to the campus police, local law enforcement, or campus security. A good compliant complaint has a statute of limitation. We've seen the statute anywhere from 1 year to 5 years. I think in Indiana ours is 2. and provide an estimated time frame for a response. Usually when you have a student that's filing a complaint, they want an answer 10 minutes ago. So it's very important that you say, we're going to investigate it and we should get back to you within 3 weeks, if not sooner. Sometimes faculty, staff who are doing the investigating need a little bit more time, but always, convey that to the person who's making the complaint. Always keep them up to date on where they are in the process. The concern is one of my favorites. It's a matter of interest or importance to someone. It doesn't really affect the student's academic progress or learning opportunities. My favorite example, and this is why there is a picture of Austin Powers talking about one-ply toilet paper. There have been 2 institutions in the United States where students have filed complaints about the institutions only providing single-ply toilet paper. And that is not necessarily a complaint. It's more of a concern. It doesn't violate any creditor policies, federal or state laws, even though some students think it does, those kinds of things. And we've seen it, and it really got our attention when we read that article. Types of complaints. You've got academic, those that deal with grades, advising, transferring, credits. Non-academic would be student conduct, discrimination, ADA title, and payments and financial aid issues are some other non-academic. So we're going to talk now about an institutional complaint process. What should this look like? Typical complaints and where they go. If it's academic, it usually goes through the instructor, the department chair, and then dean of academic affairs. Against other students, can usually start with the assistant dean or the dean of students or an ombudsman. Then it goes to an investigation. Then the results go back to the dean of students, and then the complainant gets a response. However, some institutions have different but similar processes for athletes because of NCAA rules. And faculty and staff, Office of Equity and Diversity. So that's where you might need to send students if they have very specific complaints. So some best practices. It's very important that the complainant has a single point of contact. That way they can follow up with this person. They know who they're talking to. They can follow up with them if necessary. Has only one layer of links or clicks to contacts and forms. This is important because students who usually are filing the complaint are already very frustrated, and if they can't find things or easily click and get to them, that just kind of adds fuel to the fire. Make sure that you provide a description of the whole process, the timeline, how and when a student can appeal if you have that at your campus. Always provide a written response that you received the complaint, and for every step of the process, including the conclusion or the findings of the investigation. I know that when we receive the emails here at the Commission office, I know they get an automatic receipt stating such. Provides links to written processes and policies used by folks dealing with the complaint. A lot of students aren't aware that in their handbook or student code of conduct that institutions have, okay, this is what you do if, and there's usually a flow chart or steps for them to do. So it's always good to have that very visible and out where the students can find it. Sometimes provides for an ombudsman. Sometimes it's the dean of students and student affairs, but they could have just one person who deals with complaints. It allows for unusual processes and unanticipated sorts of complaints. We have all kinds of students, as we know, with the toilet paper example. So again, it needs to be flexible, but yet also, contain the basic information that we all need. It advises about avenues outside the institution. You can't tell a student, no, you can't go see an attorney if you're filing a complaint. They do have a right to do that. Typically, we've seen that attorneys will tell them, if you haven't gone through the complaint process of the institution, you must do that first. So they've been directing them to the right area. It has clear statutes of limitations, 1 to 5 years. Explains the difference between the different kinds of complaints and where they go. So those that go to maybe the Attorney General's office, if it's something about fraud, or if it's something about a disability issue, where that goes. It always provides a disclaimer and releases about open records and FERPA laws. Not only is this important for SARA, but it's also important for institutions and state agencies, because if we are investigating, sometimes we need to send out other personal identifying information or records that help in the investigation. Allows and provides for a mediation process. In other words, that whole communication is very important, and that it's reviewed and updated on a regular basis. So it's something that we will make sure that reflects your institutional policies and any kind of developments or maintenance that's done by the federal government. And it's also good because things change so often. Go back through and make sure that the links if you have it online, if your links are correct and they're not broken. If your numbers change, or if the person that receives the complaint, that position or that person changes, to make sure that's always updated, because again, it just takes away some of the frustration from the student filing the complaint. We do not allow anonymous complaints because, for several reasons, many of them very obvious, but it's not really helping anybody if we get an anonymous complaint. We don't know how to help them. We don't know if it's legitimate, and it might indeed help the institution. It's the same for all students. It doesn't matter if they're online, residential, out-of-state, graduate, undergraduate, doesn't matter. And allows a complaint about an institutional policy itself. So it's something that they can complain about, a policy at that institution. It's appropriate in scope, and doesn't, again, define the complaints too narrow or too broad, but it's kind of flexible, again, because different circumstances, different students, different complaints. And again, very important about the releases for FERPA open records and for SARA and the portal agencies are embedded in the signature or the authorization for the person who submits the complaint, because then that gives the appropriate folks permission to go ahead and follow through on the investigation. And list the complaint processes in all of the other states, which was federally mandated. But most importantly, it's easy for a student to find and understand. Again, students are already very frustrated and probably angry and upset about something, or else they wouldn't be filing a complaint. So for them to be able to find it and understand it in very simple, broken down steps, that's very important and very helpful for everybody involved. An example of an ombuds office is Central Michigan University, and Jenny's provided a nice slide here that shows a little bit about what they do, and that they have where they can go and get additional information, reporting a concern, frequently asked questions, which is great. Another example of what she refers to as a high-tech is Columbia College, and this is one that it's mostly all online, and that's how students then would obviously file their complaint. And the University of Toledo, she selected as a low-tech model. Again, right there it shows visiting their policy. If you have questions, you can go to the website and find somebody to get you some assistance. Other examples are available on the WCET website. So we have some there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann, who's going to talk about state processes.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jenny. This is Mary Ann Boke, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a state complaint process. I'm actually only going to spend a few minutes on the state complaint process, but we thought as we were putting this presentation together that we really should explain that there are different complaint processes out there. There's the one that Sarah just talked about that's at your institution. It's institution level. Accreditors also have a complaint process, and each state has a complaint process. And this was a requirement that came out of the big federal announcement back in October of 2010. And the requirements for the states was actually a few different things, and they bundled them together in these three points that I have here. The first was that they had to approve institutions to operate in the state according to their own regulations. They had to, upon request of the U.S. DOE, provide a list of institutions that are approved by name. And the third, they had to maintain a third-party process to review and address complaints from students attending institutions approved to operate in that state. And that third bullet is the one that I'm going to talk about here. So more specifically, in those federal regulations, the feds actually state that they really want to maintain the state's role in student consumer protection. Therefore, a state must have a process applicable to all institutions except tribal and federal to review and address complaints directly or through referrals. This process is known as the state complaint process. So every state has to have this. Now, the feds, they really don't want to tell states what to do and how to do it. So what they're saying is you have to have a state complaint process. But how you go about it is really up to each individual state. So some states have particular agencies that take care of this. Others go through the Attorney General's office, and that's fine. That would actually be absolutely fine for the feds, and you would be in compliance. But they do have some guiding principles, and I've listed a couple of those there. And the first is that the state must have a process to review and appropriately act in a timely manner on complaints concerning an institution. Now the important piece on that bullet is process. So whether it goes to the Attorney General or through a state agency, there has to be a process in place. You can't be doing it fly by night or as students start to come and complain to you. You have to have those procedures written down and figured out and then follow those procedures and process. That's what the federal government is looking for. The second bullet is that the state has the final authority to resolve complaints and enforce applicable state laws and regulations. Now that doesn't mean that the state agency or the Attorney General can't look at a complaint and send it back down to an institution for further review, or even in some cases send that complaint to perhaps the accrediting agency for a review. But the bottom line is that kind of the buck stops here with the state. They have to be able to do that. And I have this quote in here, and this is from the federal guidelines, and that is that the feds believe that students, their families, and the public should have a process to lodge complaints that is independent of an institution. And I think that's important because once again, the feds are coming out with some regulations that aren't trying to be burdensome or difficult. They really are trying to protect students and families. That's what this is all about, consumer protection. So what might a state complaint process look like? Well, a state agency may ask some of the following questions. It's pretty straightforward. They're going to want to know your name, your address, the institution, and then that fifth bullet down, a full description of the problem and any other documentation that they might have. Now this information should be able to be sent via mail, email, fax, and that information should be very easily found on the state's websites. If you're going through an Attorney General's office, it may look a little bit different. In the end, you're still going to have those same bullet information points that I just stated for the agency, but you might go about it a tiny bit differently. In fact, you might be using the phone to call for your first point of contact. In other cases, you may have it all online and be able to process it that way. But in any event, you're going to have some information. You're going to have to put it into a procedure and process, and then the state agency or the Attorney General will start down the road of looking at that complaint and figuring out if they need to do something or sending it back down. And I just want to reiterate that every single state agency or Attorney General's office that I've looked at over the last couple of years have said something to this bullet point, and that is that a student must first exhaust the complaint grievance procedures established by the institution. States are really serious about this. They aren't going to get involved in someone being upset about the air conditioning in someone's classroom, or about toilet paper, or even about grades. They're going to send those complaints back down. The state process is there for students that need it for something that's going to be at the state level. So you might be asking yourself, wasn't this all struck down by the courts? Hey, I'm pretty sure that all that stuff that came out in 2010 we don't really have to do anymore, state authorization, right? All the feds, we don't have to do that. Actually, no. Only the distance education portion of the U.S. Department of Education state authorization regulations was vacated. The rest, including the complaint process, is still in place. So what that means is that there was no turning this away. We all have to do it. The states all have to have a process. And you might even ask yourself, gosh, isn't this something the states probably already had? And the answer is, for most of the states, yes, they did have it, or they had something in place. But it wasn't with those kind of guiding principles we talked about early, or it wasn't easily accessible by students. That's another big piece of this. But in any event, the idea here is that all states have to have this, and it was not vacated. So you also might be asking yourself, wasn't this all delayed? Because we keep seeing these delays come out from the feds on different pieces of the federal regulation. And in this case, you'd be right, because although the regulations dealing with state complaint processes were to go into effect July 1st of 2011, it actually was stayed not once but twice. And so the new deadline is July 1st of 2015. And they did that because they realized that some states would not have sufficient authorization or complaint review processes in place by that original deadline. Because remember, when we started this slideshow, there were 3 pieces that the states had to take care of, and this is just one of the pieces. So now they have until 2015 to get that done. But as we all look at our calendars, we realize that, gosh, that's only about 6 or 7 months away. So in just that short amount of time, all the states need to have this up and running, or they will be out of compliance with the federal government. Now, I'm going to, before I jump into this next bullet, I'm going to just kind of jump back a little bit and say, you might be asking yourself, why is she talking about a state complaint process? I work at an institution, and I know I've got to have my complaint process for my institution, but why should I really care about the state process? Well, there are 2 reasons why you should care. The first is you want to know that there is a place for your students to go if they do not get resolution at your institution. The second reason is that institutions must provide current and prospective students with contact information for filing complaints with their accredited agency and with their appropriate state agencies. And that was, again, part of the federal regulation that came down in 2010, and that was not vacated. And guess what? That was not even extended. So all institutions back in July 1st, 2011, and continuing to this day, have to have a complaint process for their institution. They have to have it listed on their website. They have to have all the state agency links listed on their website for their current and prospective students. And they have to have their accrediting information up on there too. So that's why we care. But you also might say, well, what happens if a state doesn't have a complaint process up and running yet? Because in fact there are about a handful of states, maybe 4 to 6 now, that don't have it. What do I need to do there? And the feds have been somewhat clear on this issue, and they've said that if a state agency does not have a complaint process, an institution may request a 1-year extension from the appropriate state agency. The important piece here is that each institution is responsible for obtaining its own extension, and it is the responsibility of each institution to have the exemption on the web link or the web link in place. And remember, the institutional deadline was July 1st, 2011, and it has not been extended. So that you should already have in place, ready to roll at your institution. So just some quick final thoughts, and that is that, again, I'm really hammering this home, that the deadline for the states to have their process in place is July 2015. And although the burden of the state complaint process is on the states, the lack of compliance does impact institutions because, remember, you have to have all those links up on your website. And finally, the state complaint process is not intended to replace the institutional process, but to make sure students have a place to go. And I think that is an important piece, and USDOE has been very clear about that, and states have been very clear about that. And finally, there is a list of student complaint information by state and agency. The SHEO, State Higher Education Executive Officers, have done this. It hasn't been updated since, I think, December 2012, but I hear through the grapevine that they are going to update it, and it's going to be out and available by the end of this year. And that is really just a wonderful document because it has all of those links already ready for you. And the feds have even said that you can link to that from your website. And that really helps save time and whatnot. But for today, I wouldn't say rely on that because it is I think out of date. It's 2 years old, and I just think that's probably not the way to go. We can talk about this more at the end if you guys have questions about what items should be on your institution's website as far as meeting that deadline. And I really do encourage folks to go back and look at it because I know there were a lot of institutions that kind of slapped something up to meet that 2011 deadline. But now's the time to kind of go back and think about it again, and making sure that you have information about your institution's complaint process. You have your accreditation information up there, including their complaint process. You have state agency complaint web links, either attached to that SHEO list or on your own. And also your state authorization information up there too. And again, we can talk about that more at the end if you want to, but I just wanted to put it out there so that folks know what's happening. And we do have two, oops, did I go too fast? I did. There are a couple of examples of state complaint processes. And North Dakota's got a good low-tech solution here. It has tons of good information, but you might have to call in or print something else and mail it in. And the next one would be Indiana, and that's a high-tech solution where you can do everything right there online. It's all web interface, and that's really great too. So that was kind of my quick overview of the state complaint process and where we are with that. I'm now going to, I believe, switch this over to Part 4, Compliance Requirements from Title IV and DOD.
Thanks, Marianne. This is Jenny again. I and Linda Dummer from Embry-Riddle will be talking to you about some specific compliance requirements for Title IV and in the Department of Defense. I don't want you to think that there aren't some additional requirements out there. We just didn't cover them in this particular webinar. And they tend not to be highly detailed. But you should also remember there are requirements from your accreditor for how you use and post and make decisions about your complaint process. And that's always something that you can find in your accreditation materials and will want to revisit, of course, periodically, but in particular when you're up for reaccreditation. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and talk to you very briefly about the requirements that Title IV, for Title IV compliance and Title IV participation by your institution, there are some rules for your complaint process. They are not very specific though, so you won't get a lot of the finely grained points here that you will in some of the other material. But in general, and this will sound redundant a little bit, you must provide a process for online and out-of-state students as well as for on-the-ground and in-state students. There is sometimes some confusion about the complaints and the processes that students who aren't in your state or residents on your campus, but they all have to go through the exact same process, and it has to be equally available and accessible to all of them. And as Marianne said, you must post a list of the state-level complaint agencies and processes in every state where you have current or prospective students. And so here's a good example. We've had a couple of chat questions come in about best practices, and we will talk to you later about where we're getting these ideas for best practices, and they tend to be a conversation among those of us dealing with this issue. But this is one that we would recommend. Go ahead and post the link to all the states because you don't necessarily know where your prospective students, the students looking to access your institution and attend your institution, are coming from. So probably the best practice is to go ahead and just post links to all of those. And again, as the SHEO site is updated, that becomes a much easier task. Okay, and I've heard from some of you in chats that there is a delay between when I switch a slide and when my voice comes through. So I am going to do a little bit of a lag here. The slide right now should say Title IV Complaint Process Requirements. And again, I just mentioned that they're not very specific. If you want the actual documentation and some nice Dear Colleague letters and some question and answer letters. I've provided these links. They will be part of the documentation that is sent out with the questions and answers too. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a little bit of context for another set of federal level requirements, the Department of Defense requirements. And I'll start with a little bit of context here. I mentioned earlier Executive Order 13607, the Principles of Excellence for establishing higher education practices for military members, veterans, and their families. It was signed April 27, 2012, and not always everyone in an institution will work with all parts of compliance and financial aid, etc. But these were a set of principles that you can access through that link there that established some expectations for the level at which institutions would serve members of the military and veterans. And as such, one of the conversations I've had with the folks as we've been putting together this webinar is that, really if you follow the principles of excellence for all your students, you'll be doing very, very well. It's a very consumer-friendly model. It's very respectful of students, and it optimizes their opportunities both to access education, continue to access and complete, but also to lodge a complaint when it's justified. Now, stemming out of that executive order and all of the things it set in motion was the Voluntary Educational Partnership Memorandum of Understanding, or the DoD MOU. I always used to love it when I was at the institution, and I'd say, well, our meeting today is about the DoD MOU stemming out of EO 13607. It was kind of fun. Not everyone thought it was fun, but it was fun for me to say. Anyway, you can access it at the link I presented to you there. But the Memorandum of Understanding, I think most of you have probably signed it and had to set in motion the requirements inside it because it allows you to access tuition assistance funds for active military personnel and their qualifying dependents. So when you go to that link, this is the site you're taken to. And I just wanted to show you, you can see my little arrow there. I couldn't get the whole site on the slide. So if you go right down there, should be, okay, again, they take a little bit. There should be something there. There should be a nice little one that's got an American flag on it called Military One Source. This is where you get to what's called the Post-Secondary Education Complaint System. And indeed, it is a centralized complaint system that, that the military set up earlier this year as kind of an alternative to institutional or state processes that under certain circumstances military personnel can access. Okay, I just got something showing me that the one link is invalid. So we're gonna double check that and make sure we get back to you on how to make that work. I apologize for that. Okay, so well, I think I've already started presenting Linda's stuff when I was. Sorry about that.
That's okay, Jenny.
All right, I'm going to let you take over at this point, Linda.
All right. Hi, I'm Linda Dammer, and if you don't mind, I'm going to back up 2 slides. I think I can clarify that link, perhaps. Where that red arrow shows, there are 2 boxes, and there's a box that says Resources. And where those under that resources, it will say DoD launches the Post-Secondary Education Complaint System. And from that point, you will get something called the Post-Secondary Education Complaint System, and they call it PECS notice. And within that document, there is a link that says Post-Secondary Education Complaint System. That brings you into this form and this page with all the information. So it's kind of a 2-step to get to this post-secondary education complaint system. But this form is really great because it tells you when to submit a complaint, and that's important because it really helps the students. And from that, again, we go by the Principles of Excellence, which is actually the Principles of Excellence you'll find on most of the links anything to do with the DoD complaint process or the federal. But again, the principles of excellence, the types of complaints that the Department of Defense will review are recruiting and marketing practices, accreditation, financial issues, for example, tuition and fee charges, student loans, post-graduation job opportunities, change in degree plan and requirements, quality of education, grade policy, release of transcripts, transfer of credit, refund or collection issues, or other. And I believe everybody is probably familiar with the reason why they're doing that, again, is because, especially when the Chapter 33 came out, there were some institutions that were really going about aggressively recruiting students. So there were just a lot of things. So that's what put this really into play to begin with. The Department of Defense process requirements, again, here is a link which will take you to that information. Real good source. And the DoD complaint system may be used by students who are active military service members, veterans, eligible family members of both above. Satisfy that requirement. And the DoD complaint system may be used as a primary or a secondary complaint system after an institutional and or state process has been resolved. And again, it's the active military service members, veterans, eligible family members, or of both above. And this is a recommendation for best practice. In our institution, the Department of Defense point of contact should be someone who is intimately connected to the institution's main complaint process. And it's kind of hard to see, but this is the form when you applied for your MOU. You can see that I am the DoD point of contact. I am also the complaint person for the entire campus. So any student complaints or grievances, regardless of whether the student is military or not, actually come through me. And as far as that being a best practice, I found it very helpful. Number one, I know about most of the complaints and grievances if they're escalated to my level. So should something come to me from the DoD, I pretty much already have a really good file and am knowledgeable about the complaint to begin with. So we found that to be very beneficial. Also, to have someone at the institution who is familiar with most of the departments is also very helpful, because I know where to direct, or the person in my office knows where to direct things to get the information and gather that information, and knows what questions to ask students, the instructors, financial aid, etc. So again, we found that to be very helpful to have the point of contact for our DoD also be the person that all students can come through. We also have a grievance form right on the student site on our student services page, and it says student grievance form, and that comes in directly to me, and that's where students can put in their own words what their grievance is, and I also ask them for what the resolution is that they're looking for, and I find that very helpful because it kind of gives the students, they can complain, but what is it they're looking for? What is the resolution they're seeking? So again, that's one of our best practices. And so again, if a DoD complaint came through, and I apologize that I'm kind of going back and forth between DoD complaints and our student body complaint system, but an example of a best practice is when I would get a complaint from the DoD, which would come first, I must have a FERPA disclosure on hand. If I don't have something showing that the student has allowed me to answer those questions, I have to go back to the DoD and say I can't do anything until I have a FERPA disclosure, and then I'll go back to the student. Again, communicating between various entities, I'm kind of that center person. I collect information from all the different offices, the student, instructor, financial aid, whomever. And I also close the loop. I make sure that I'm the one who communicates with the student, even if it's another office that might be gathering the majority of the information or the student may have had the complaint against. I often will close that loop. And I also recommend that you put the link to the DOD process on your institutional complaint and process website. And now I am going to turn that over to Part 5, Alan Contreras.
Thank you. I'm glad to have a chance to be here today again. I'm going to talk a bit about the SARA complaint process and how it works. I'd like to start by going back to a question that came up earlier, which is what happens in that small number of states that maybe don't quite have their process established yet. And one of the things that happens is that a state that does not have a complete operational complaint process in place cannot join SARA at all. So it's a prerequisite, it's a requirement to get into SARA that you have to have a complaint process available for all of your institutions that are going to be potentially doing distance ed through SARA. So that's something that has to be in there. The most important thing I think about these processes under SARA is that they follow the norm, if you will, within higher education, which is that the student first has to go through the institution's internal process. The other thing that, institutions sometimes don't understand is that the only thing we use the SARA complaint process for is for activities that are conducted under SARA. And what that means is that SARA's complaint process can only be used in the case of a complaint originating outside the state. That is to say, it has to be from a student that is located in another state and is therefore doing something under SARA. So that is something to keep in mind. The other thing is that states sometimes think, well, because SARA gives the home state's agency the authority to do enforcement for what its institutions are up to, that means that my state, where the student lives, can't do anything at all to help our own citizens, and that is not the case. The state where the student lives can do at least a couple of things. One is that the state's education agency can certainly assist the local student in doing anything they need to in contacting the agency in the home state for the institution and in working with that agency. The only thing they can't do is do the final resolution of the case. The other thing is that if a state has a general purpose consumer protection statute of some kind, which I think just about everybody does, and there's some case of fraud or something of that nature, there's nothing to prevent the Attorney General or the other appropriate state official, for example, a consumer protection agency, from acting using those general purpose statutes. There's been a little bit of confusion over this because SARA does supersede the regulatory schemes that operate out of the state's education units that are normally used only for colleges and universities. But SARA does not supersede any of the state's general purpose consumer protection statutes that can be applied to any business or any provider. So just keep that in mind. We've had a couple of questions about which states do not have a process that's currently compliant with the federal guidelines. I don't know the answer to that, but every state that is joining SARA has demonstrated that it has a process in place in order to do that. So that's how things work under SARA. The process that's used by SARA is fairly straightforward, and there is an expectation that a complaint that goes into a state agency where the institution is will also be shared with the state portal agency of the state where the student is living, and also with the SARA office and the regional compact as needed. We don't really have a sense yet of what the volume of complaints is going to be regarding institutions operating under SARA. Right now there are 9 SARA member states. By the end of November, I think there will be 18, 19, possibly even 20, and certainly when we get into next year there's going to be a much larger number. So right now it's a little hard to tell. The other thing to keep in mind is that the SARA complaint process does not supersede or change anything that's required by the federal government, some of those things that have been mentioned earlier. Now, most of what SARA is going to handle is going to relate to things like recruiting and marketing and issues related to professional licensure. One of the things SARA does not do is it does not change any requirements that a professional licensing board, such as a nursing board, a teacher licensing board, a psychology board, imposes on someone to be licensed to practice in that state. What that means is that even though under SARA you can operate in that state if it's another SARA state, you still have to make sure that if you're offering courses or programs that are related to professional licensure, that you have, if you will, checked in with the licensing boards to make sure that you're meeting any requirements they may have. In many states there aren't any, but in some states there may well be. This may relate to clinical placements, or it may relate to the substance of a particular course or program. The third kind of violation that can theoretically come up is what we call a violation of the CRAC guidelines. These are the guidelines relating to best practices for distance education, and our expectation is that there are not going to be a whole lot of this kind of thing. So I'm going back to the recruiting and marketing practices. An example of a complaint that could arise here would be if an institution were to say, this course meets the requirements for you to become a teacher in state X, when in fact it does not. That is a licensure issue, but it is also a recruiting and marketing issue, and SARA requires that such things be accurate. So that's how that might come up. Now, here we have a list pretty much of things that SARA doesn't do. Now, in theory, you can raise such a complaint at any time, anywhere, but realistically, there are certain things that SARA is not going to be involved in at all. 2 of those are expressly excluded by SARA's own internal policy: grade disputes and student conduct disputes. But there are others that are listed here that are examples of things that are in effect superseded by existing federal agencies that are specialized in that do things of that nature. So that gives you some idea of what SARA does not do. Here is a little chart that gives you an idea of what happens and how the process works. It's important to realize that the only time the SARA procedure can be used is if both states are SARA states, that is to say, the state containing the institution and the state containing the student. If you don't have that situation in place, then you cannot use the SARA process. I referred earlier to the CRAC standards. Those are the standards that the Council of Regional Accrediting Commissions developed and have implemented and are using themselves until recently for what are called best practices for distance education. What these cover are things like faculty qualifications, the fact the institution has adequate access to library resources, things of that nature. And those are available online or from the SARA office if anybody needs to have access to those. Now, people wonder, well, how does the SARA process actually differ from what states do? The answer is probably not very much. The whole front end of the process is identical because you have to start with the institution and go through that process. In effect, you then are going to an agency inside the institution's own state, which in some cases already has some kind of appeal or oversight authority for complaints. In other cases, it may not, but in order to participate in SARA, an institution has agreed that that state portal agency would have, that's what SPA stands for, by the way, is State Portal Agency, that agency would be able to handle complaints relating to the out-of-state students who are taking courses or programs under SARA. The SARA Regional Steering Committee is not going to be hearing individual SARA cases, but it will be reviewing how states do their business and making sure that the states are actually performing the test that they are supposed to. And I'll get to a couple of the other questions after this webinar is over, and the responses will be available to you in about a week. Now, there's a couple of different ways that that student complaints happen, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these, but the mechanical processes are going to vary a little bit from state to state. The thing to keep in mind under SARA, the most important thing is the whole front end of the process is going to be identical to that is normal in most complaint processes, which is the student has to go completely through the institution's process before going into the SARA process. I'm not sure that I mentioned earlier that the SARA process has a 2-year limit to it. Once 2 years has passed from the date of whatever the problem was, the SARA complaint process cannot be used. So I'm just going to pop through the next couple of slides here and just good examples of how to make a mess, how you don't want to do things. The idea of the SARA process is to have a single jurisdiction that is always responsible for what is done by institutions. And the way SARA is set up, the state in which the institution is located is the one that is ultimately responsible for enforcing the requirements of SARA, even though the states where the students are located can, of course, assist in that process. And this slide is an example of the kind of clarity that we're aiming for to make sure that it can be done that way. I realize I'm bouncing through these slides a little quickly, but this detailed information is going to be available to you later on, and if anybody that has any questions can contact any of us about this. So this is just a sense of how SARA is intending to work. Once again, since we're brand new, we are developing a process kind of as we go along, but we're trying to keep it aligned as closely as possible with what the norms have been in other kinds of complaint processes. And I will do my best to catch up with you on questions as the day goes on and later on at the end of the process. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is Jenny. I am wanting to make sure that all of the slides and all the verbiage are caught up. So the slide I am looking at now is called a wrap-up, and I'll give I think someone timed it. Thank you, whoever did that, said it's about a 6-second delay. But in the wrap-up, the basic questions I figured most of you would have at the end of all this is, what does my institution need to do, for what reasons, and by when? What is acceptable and what are the best practices? And what are the risks of non-compliance? So assuming that you all can see those, I'm going to pop to the next slide and start talking about those. All right, so first of all, it's really important, and Marianne and Sarah and I do believe Linda all mentioned this. Go ahead and review and make compliant all your complaint processes with the special instructions for out-of-state and online students, those in and outside SARA if you've already joined SARA. It is especially important, the first part of what I have put there, the fact that you need to have information for your out-of-state and online students is required by the Department of Ed. And the latter part there, where you have to talk about SARA and non-SARA students, is required for SARA participation. So go ahead and review everything. And like we said before, it's really basic stuff. Are the links still accurate, and are they still functioning? Is everything up to date? Are all of the recent rule changes at the state level and at the federal level reflected in your process there? There are many. So what are best practices? What's acceptable? There are many, many good examples out there. I often recommend that you talk to your state regulators. They're going to know a lot about these things because they're constantly reviewing applications from institutions and looking at their complaint processes to see if they pass muster for authorization. The WCET website also has some great links on it. Like with the SHIO website, it's coming up on its update/renewal cycle, so some of them are not functioning links either, but again, those are all getting cleaned up and updated soon. And then what are the repercussions? What are the consequences? Well, there are federal, state repercussions and individual legal repercussions. So we already know that there are certain federal laws and that they are it's insinuated that they will eventually be tied to Title IV eligibility. We do expect some new rules in the spring of 2015 coming out of the negotiated rulemaking last spring. And then the state laws are always changing. Again, for those states that don't already have a compliant process, that changes. But as the world of state authorization and compliance becomes ever more complex, I know any of you who work in state authorization know that the rules change all the time. There are also, you do expose yourself to lawsuits if you don't have an adequate complaint process. You also need to worry about your institution's reputation, student satisfaction. All of those things can really hurt your institution. And again, there's the exposure legally, but there's also the exposure to morale and enrollment, all the things that would be negatively impacted by a decrease in reputation and student satisfaction. And if you're interested in joining the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement eventually, you do need to have a compliant complaint process. It needs to work well in order for your institution to be approved by your SARA state. So I am going to now move on to the question and answer phase. And what I will do is I will read the questions that we've got and begin to ask our other co-presenters to answer them verbally. I just will remind you all that all of these questions will go into a written document that we will email to you next week along with all the links from the webinar that were referenced. Several of you have made mention of the fact that there are some shortcomings in the SHIO list, and I think Marianne had indicated that that will be updated soon. We have sent out among the chat the edited version of the executive order link that someone had said wasn't working. And also a number of you have asked for some sample FERPA releases and some sample open records releases. So we'll try to find some good examples of those, realizing that they will differ by state in your specific requirements. That's a really important thing to mention. But we can show you definitely what those look like in the places that are have a very compliant process and are attending to these matters. So those things are forthcoming. Okay, so I'm just going to start here with some of these really important questions we've got. And boy, there are a lot. All right, I have heard that some of the accreditors think institutions should not directly link to the SHIO website list. Is this true? Or can you reflect on that? That sounds like a Marianne question.
Yep, Jenny, I can definitely talk about that. I think what the person might be asking about is actually the feds, because USDOE, when it first came out with this requirement, actually said you could not link to any other listing. They backtracked on that in one of their Dear Colleague letters. So now they actually specifically say you can link to the SHIO list. However, as we all have talked about earlier, the SHIO list isn't as up-to-date as it could be. So I think as soon as they update it this at the end of this year, that is a really good, viable option. But until then, I might be a little leery about doing that only because it's out of date and you want to have the most current and up-to-date links as possible. I haven't heard that accreditors have said one way or the other about being able to use it or not. But it would really be the federal government that would have the final say-so on that because they're the ones who made the law. So does that help?
Well, we're going to hope so. Thank you, Marianne. That was actually a really great answer. We appreciate it. For any of these, once you get the answers written and you still have questions, you'll have all of our contact information and we'll be able to follow up. I've got another question here, and it says, does the student go to the institution, state, or to their own state? And I think there are two answers here. Alan described the SARA process, but there is the non-SARA process. Alan, do you want to talk about this once again? This is one of the greatest areas of confusion we often encounter when we go out and talk about SARA.
Sure. The most important thing to remember is that the SARA process only covers students that are outside the state where the institution is located. I mean, even if we assume that every state's eventually a member, that will still be true. In addition, institutions are not obligated to operate under SARA. So an institution could have distance ed students all over the country, and if they're not operating under SARA, they would use different complaint processes. So the only thing the SARA complaint process handles is if you are an institution in Oregon and you are offering a course to a student in Colorado, since they're both SARA member states, if the institution has decided to operate under SARA, then what happens is that the Oregon State Portal Agency becomes ultimately responsible for what that Oregon provider does to a student in any other state and has to resolve complaints under it. But that is going to be a relatively small proportion of total complaints, even if every state is in SARA, because every in-state complaint, whether about on-the-ground activity or distance ed in the state, has nothing to do with SARA, and you have to use whatever the other procedures are.
Okay, Alan, thank you. Connected to that, there is a question here. Which state has precedence when a non-SARA state is involved when there's a mismatch? And there was a chart about this. If there is a student in a non-SARA state attending an institution in a SARA state, or vice versa, where does the student go then?
Jenny, this is Alan. I'd like to comment on that very briefly. Part of the answer is going to depend on what the law is in each state. There are states that exercise a very high level of oversight over distance ed, states like Minnesota, and it may well be that agency would have considerable authority over an Oregon provider that's operating in Minnesota, because the Oregon provider is going to have to be licensed by the state of Minnesota to offer a course to one student there. But in other states, such as Idaho, that don't normally do a lot of oversight activity with a post-secondary provider doing distance ed, there may not be a state agency policy that would apply. So the student would have to look, in that case, I think, to the state where the institution is located. So it's going to vary quite a bit.
Thanks, Alan. And again, that's one of the benefits that SARA brings to the table, is that it does clarify the line of complaint reporting and resolution. We have an institutional complaint question, and I'm going to give this one to Sarah Appel. It says, can the institutional appeals process be part of the complaint process? I'm not exactly sure what's being asked there. Maybe you know, Sarah, and can comment on that.
Well, it depends. Some institutions have an appeals process regarding complaints. Some institutions have judicial committees comprised of students that sometimes might get involved. Other times they do not. The word is the word of the institution, and then that would be where if the student doesn't get satisfaction there, would then take it then to the state level if it's something that the state can review. I hope that helps.
That does. Thank you very much. Okay, we have some questions about Are there some other resources besides our webinar on best practices? Who determines best practices? Where are these discussions occurring? And I would love to open that up to anyone on the panel to offer any insight.
Well, this is Alan. Are we talking about best practices regarding complaint procedures? I don't think there are very many sources for that kind of thing.
Yes, I do think that's the question, Alan. And just to answer the person and just folks in general out there, that's one of the reasons we decided that this needed to be one of the first webinars we did this year, because there didn't seem to be a great deal of information out there on best practices, comprehensive practices, and kind of nesting all of the different requirements and practices together and figuring out then, for our purposes, how that differs or overlaps or dovetails with the SARA practice. So we will continue to keep trying to develop some lists and try to have them vetted by people who are experts in the area, and that's one of the things we would like to be able to offer you as your SARA providers. All right. I'm looking at some of these other questions. Are there typically areas that complaint processes or types of complaints that trip up public institutions? I'm thinking that would be a Sarah or a Mary Ann question to answer.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that from Sarah's point of view. The biggest thing that public institutions forget is that most of their legal authority to do what they do stops at the state line. I mean, they have a charter or license to operate from the state that they grew up in. But that doesn't mean that they can just go do whatever they want to in any other state. That's a very, very common misunderstanding on the part of public institutions. Some states exempt them, some don't, and it's entirely a matter of what the receiving state is doing. So just in terms of SARA for interstate operations, that's by far the biggest problem.
This is Mary Ann. I might just address that pretty quickly, and that is that I totally echo what Alan just said. I would say also that when the federal regulation came out and everyone had to be compliant by 2011, what a lot of institutions did, particularly the big research public institutions, is they slapped up a splash page on their website that just had a few words on it and a few phone numbers. And I really encourage everyone to go back now and look at their website and see what they have up there, because now is just a wonderful opportunity to go there and educate your students, not only about where they need to go for the institutional process for a complaint, where they need to go for the accreditation complaint process, and where they need to go for the other state complaint process links. But this is your opportunity to really explain what Sarah was talking about, the difference between a complaint and a concern. You can really set these pages up in a way that educates the student and also helps the institution and the state, because by explaining this in a really meaningful way, you can kind of help the student navigate it easier and better and know where they should be going and when, so that students aren't bounced around from place to place, but also that students know the difference between a complaint and a concern. So I think the time is now to go and look at those again, because it's been about 3 years. And if you don't have it up yet, you need to get it up and do that quickly, because the feds expected that up 3 years ago. I think that kind of covers what that question was asking.
This is Sarah Appel. A couple things. Well, I guess basically just one thing. A lot of institutions, when they have new student orientations, they go through the student handbook or the student code of conduct, and they show them where the complaint process is. And I think that's one of the most important and easy things to do in helping students navigate their campus experience, is just tell them this is where the process is, this is how you follow it if in case you ever need to do so. And again, that they stress that your complaint has to start here on the campus, and then you can follow the rest of the steps.
Everyone, that was fantastic. Thank you for all of those different pieces of information and perspectives. We do have, I guess, what you would call more of a philosophical question, but I imagine there are some contexts in which this could become a practical question. The question is, how can you have a statute of limitations on your complaint process in light of the push for greater consumer protections now in many states? And I'm not aware of states that necessarily, perhaps there are laws in some of the states that establish an actual statute of limitations or forbid one for a higher ed complaint, but I am not familiar with any legislation of that nature. Have any of you encountered anything like that on one end or the other, or have any comments?
Well, SARA has a 2-year limit. I don't really know what various state laws are right now, but that's how SARA does it.
Sarah, did you have any other experiences with statutes of limitations and how those might or might not be allowed by a state?
No, I agree with Alan. It just kind of varies. In Indiana, I know that our institution process and then our state process went past the Attorney General's office just for double checking. And for us, it's just a flat 2 years. But states vary.
Sure. And that might be something in the future that that you might want to check into. Does your state actually have any established limitations? Or you might want to just parallel, I don't know, the ones that they do. But checking with your general counsel at the institutional level, or again with your state regulator and possibly the in-house counsel or the AG who represents their interests might give you some ideas there in your state of what limits there might be on your ability to set a statute of limitations on your complaint process. One of the questions asked, is there ever a time when parents have access to an institutional or state complaint process? And I thought I would leave that up to you guys because, again, it's more in your line of work.
That's a great question. This is Sarah Appel. Sometimes we have helicopter parents that want to be a support for their son or daughter or person that they're guardian of. And if that's the case, actually students who are over the 18 and above are considered adults, and they're covered under FERPA, and they would have to have a special release, is my understanding, in order for that parent or that guardian to become involved. Alan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to go back to my years of experience as the Oregon regulation officer. The thing that we got, occasionally we'd hear from a parent, but we also had a couple of instances in which an employer contacted the state, my office, and said, the graduates of this program are no good. Basically saying, filing a complaint not as a student, but as an employer of the students, saying that the students coming out of a particular program were simply not prepared to do the work. In this case, I believe it was a medical assisting program, the most recent one I was thinking of. So there are rare situations where a complaint comes up, not really from the experience a student had, but from a third party. And that, of course, we took very seriously. But there are unexpected things like that happen.
Thank you. That third party complaint is kind of especially where it concerns parents, is an interesting area that a lot of people don't think about sometimes. And I've been asked for the links and some updates regarding SARA across the nation, and so that will be part of the links that we are sending out to everyone. You'll be able to see which states have applied, which states have been accepted, and if you reference some of the other webinars that we've given earlier in this year, you're going to hear a lot more about the update of SARA. If you are new to the whole SARA plan and SARA game plan, you should look at those because you'll get an idea of how it works, what it offers you, and how you can get on board. If your state has joined, and if your state hasn't joined, you can see how you can work to help your state get on board. Let's see. we're getting a lot of questions asking which states are the ones that don't yet have a federally compliant complaint process yet. And I know none. I don't think any of the ones I've been working with are like that. I don't know if any of you have an idea of which states those are.
This is Marianne. I can talk to that a little bit. I actually didn't put that in my presentation on purpose because it's sort of a moving target. And there's two separate questions. If you ask the question, what states think that they have a complaint process in place that's compliant with the federal government, you'd probably get an answer of, probably 45 of them. There's probably only 4 or 5 that absolutely do not have one up yet. However, if you ask the question, how many states have a complaint process that's in compliance with the federal regulations, those guidelines I talked about earlier, I think some of the states might be surprised that they don't actually have a process in place. Some states believe that students should just know to call the Attorney General. And some higher education folks kind of go along with that idea. That is not enough for the federal rule. You have to have it visible. It has to be somewhere where students can see it, and there has to be a process. You can't just kind of wing it when someone calls. So that's why I didn't talk about it, because since they have until July 15th or July 1st of 2015 to get that in place, there's going to be a lot of movement, I would suspect, over the next 6 or 7 months to make sure that every state has a process and that they are following it and that it is somewhere where students can see it. And that is why it's so important for institutions to kind of keep their ear to the ground on this issue, because it's up to you as an institution to have those links and processes up on your website. So you need to be following it a little bit so that you can keep track of who's changed and who hasn't, because what I've seen over the last year is a movement away from the Attorney General to the state agency and putting that process there. And I think with the advent of SARA, I think we're going to see more of that. So there's going to be some movement here in the next 6-7 months. But just to give you a quick idea, because I know people want to hear what state it might be, and I understand that. I've been on webinars myself. Hawaii did not have a complaint process for a very long time because they had no state authorization procedure in place at all. That has been changing very rapidly, and they, in fact, I believe, have a process now either up and running or it will be soon. Last I heard, New Jersey did not have a procedure in place, but they too are working on it. Every state I know is re-examining this so that they are in compliance with the federal rules by July of 2015. So again, keep your ear to the ground, and we'll know a lot more as the months go on.
This is Alan. As we have been working with states that are starting to enter SARA, we have discovered that states think they're in compliance with all kinds of things when in fact they're not. The main problem tends to be that states do not have a process in place to handle complaints arising from their long-standing established nonprofit private providers, the schools that have been there for 100 years. In many cases, the state simply doesn't have any way of handling a complaint arising out of those schools, and in order to join SARA, they have to. And in order to meet the federal standard, they have to. And in many states, one of the reasons that they kind of sort of don't is that there is a significant amount of local political pushback saying, oh no, we won't go, from the private nonprofit providers. But there is no way for such an institution to participate in SARA unless they agree that for the courses and programs they offer outside their home state, for which they will no longer have to go through the other states' oversight procedures, they agree that their local portal agency does have to have that authority. Some states, as they have developed these procedures, have realized that they now have them in place for SARA activity but not for other things, and they're now having to scramble around and figure out how to meet the federal standard. One state attempted to say that because it now met the SARA standard, it automatically met the federal standard and therefore didn't have to do anything, and we politely pointed out that SARA only covered stuff that happened outside that state. and only those institutions that chose to participate. So they have now gone back to try to fix that problem, and I don't know what they're going to do.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so we're getting near the end here. I have one other question, and I've invited any extras that people want to go ahead and submit. But one of the questions that came in early on, and I'm not exactly sure what they're asking, but again, you guys might know. They're asking, will a SARA complaint process deal at all with tuition discounting, or do other complaint processes? What's your experience with? And I'm wondering if it's not discounting, if it might be refunds that are being asked about. In either case, SARA or non-SARA, does anyone from the panel want to tackle that question?
Oh, this is Alan. I don't think tuition discounting is, in my experience, a completely separate animal from any refund policies. This is the first time that anyone has ever asked me about tuition discounting in the context of SARA. It simply hasn't come up. There's unless there was something about it that constituted a false statement or some kind of fraudulent activity, I don't think SARA would cover it. But I suspect that people can come up with all kinds of examples. Again, we haven't had this question before.
All right, thank you, Alan. So I do have this one last question here. It seems like SARA folks should know which states have the DOE compliant complaint processes. A table like this would be very helpful to SARA participating institutions and to all institutions. Agreed. I think Marianne was very helpful in telling you, though, that things are changing so quickly at the state level that by the time we could vet this information and get it onto a list, it would be out of date. For any of those of you who work in this field, you know that you almost can't keep up with how quickly things change, especially around July and August when we have enactment dates of various new state laws. But we will try to help you all with this as much as possible as your institutions seek to join SARA. So I'm just trying to think. One more question.
Well, Jenny,
go ahead.
Jenny, this is Alan. I'd like to comment on that. SARA has nothing to do with complaint processes internal to a state and never will. It's not set up to do that. There isn't any reason why SARA would have to research that question, because all we have to have in place is a complaint process regarding the institution's activities under SARA, which are always interstate and which can be done through a memorandum of agreement or a contract arrangement or something like that. I don't think that SARA intends to develop any kind of database of which states are in compliance with those federal regulations, because we don't need to for purposes of SARA, and we don't have the staffing to just add additional duties like that.
That's true, Alan. Thank you.
Hey, Jenny, this is Marianne. Can I just tack something onto that too? I think that for now, you want to look at that SHIO list, because even though it might be out of date, it does have quite a few live links still, and it does have some wording for each of the states that talks about the process. So I think it gives you a good idea of what's out there. I'd also like to give states a little bit of slack here, because the federal government was a little vague about what all this means and what has to happen. And so states are sort of scrambling at this point, trying to get this done and get it done right. So when I said that it's a moving target on how many states are currently have a complaint process in place that would meet the federal guideline, it really is a moving target, because the feds haven't started auditing that. They haven't started checking it. They haven't called anyone out in the carpet yet for saying they've done it wrong. So we kind of all have to kind of wait and see what happens. But I think for states' perspective, they are looking at it and they're trying to figure out, all right, what we've been doing for a while, is this good enough? Do we have a procedure in place that we follow? Is it accessible to everyone to see? And does it actually have that second bullet I talked about? Can the agency or the Attorney General actually come down and with a ruling that's followed through from an institution, even if it's a public institution that's been there, as Alan said, for 100 years. So all of those little nuances have to come to play, and all the parts have to come together by July of 2015. But most states do have something there, if that helps.
Yep, I think that's fabulous. Thank you, Mary Ann. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. Do we have any other comments from any of our other co-presenters? All right, well, thank you everyone. We will follow up as soon as we can within about a week and make sure that you have all the information to which we referred today, and you have everyone's contact information in the PowerPoint. And we thank you very kindly. We'll see you at our next webinar. Goodbye.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye.